and welcome to our presentation, The Crossover, Evaluating Mainstream Consumption of Urban Music Concerts. I am Morgan Bryant, an assistant professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. I teach marketing research, marketing analytics, and I am the lead for the entertainment marketing major here on campus.
I'm Eric Holt, and welcome to our talk. I'm a professor and an assistant professor of music business at Belmont University right here in Nashville, Tennessee. And I teach copyright law. I also teach venue management, concert promotions, and artist management.
One of the reasons that Eric and I are partnering on this particular research project is because our respective areas of expertise really work together nicely to accomplish our goals here. As a marketer and a marketing research and research methods person, I tend to focus a lot on consumer behavior and consumer analytics in my research and methods and techniques. And I tend to do so quite often in social media spaces. So I look a lot at social commerce, which is the intersection of consumption and social media and social networking digital platforms.
And my research and professional interests lie in copyright law and entrepreneurship in the entertainment spaces. And my professional experience prior to becoming an assistant professor here at Belmont focused on the areas of venue and event marketing and promotions.
There are several other factors in academic and industry environments that we'd like to investigate further that also leverage our respective areas of expertise and interests. One of them is just as assistant professors, we both have an immediate and pressing need to continue to develop our research portfolios from a professional perspective. But also what's really nice right now is there are organizations like the one you see here, Race in the Marketplace, that are consortiums of academics from a variety of interdisciplinary areas across the academy that focus on looking at different ways that race plays out in the marketplace and other areas of consumption. And there are a lot of calls to focus in this space, particularly as we see right now as race and other issues of social justice have come to the forefront in a lot of different areas. That combines with a focus in digital space. And so you'll see as we describe our research project, how digital social platforms play into both the research in general, but also the data sources and availability of data that we'll be using to conduct our particular research project.
So recently, we've seen changes in music consumption. Traditionally, concerts and tours were used as promotional experiences to drive people to purchase albums. As we all know, no one's buying music anymore. And so as we move towards a streaming society and a streaming experience with music, what has increased what has decreased is the physical sales of records, and what has increased are more live music experiences. So physical unit sales have declined, and they've been replaced by large streaming consumption of music. This shift has also altered primary monetary compensation of artists, placing greater emphasis on tours and revenue from those tours versus percentages of album sales. At the same time, popularity of music genres have somewhat shifted in the U.S. market. Pop and rock music dominance have been surpassed by Black music formats for the first time. And you saw this shift mainly around 2016, 2017. And the most recent data, 2019 Nielsen reports, that trend is sustaining. Presently, there exists a need and an opportunity to evaluate the consumption trends in Black music concerts and live performances.
So, as Eric mentioned, one of the drivers for wanting to look at this is both the shift from consuming physical units of music to consuming both digital and concerts, live music experiences, and seeing a shift in the dominance of the genres from things like pop to more of the Black music categories like R&B and hip hop. So what we're seeing on this particular slide is looking at the share of total volume by both format, which is across the top of the table, and genre, which we can see down the left side of the table. This is 2017 Nielsen music data. This is the first year that we saw the shift of the Black music formats begin to come to the forefront. And as Eric mentioned, that seems to be sustaining through 2019 data that Nielsen has reported. What's important to see here is that rap and hip hop, or R&B and hip hop, the Black music genres, are really showing the lead in total volume here. So they've surpassed pop, they surpassed rock, coming in at 24.5%, with rock a close second at just under 21%. What's interesting, however, is how R&B and hip hop has achieved that. If you read out to the right of the table, you'll immediately see that under total album sales, rock is still leading by a large margin over R&B and hip hop. And that continues if you continue to the right and look at physical album sales. So they're leading in total album sales, and that is driven primarily by their lead in physical album sales. Again, you see that again in digital album sales. So from a traditional album perspective, rock is still the lead. But where R&B and hip hop, where Black music picks up its steam and ultimately carries it to the top of this list in 2017, is really out in the digital space and out in the non-album consumption category. So we see from digital song sales, but then the non-sales categories, particularly from on-demand streaming, we see where R&B and hip hop are leading by a large margin, almost twice that of rock and more than twice that of pop, both in total on-demand streams, on-demand audio streams, and again in the video stream environment. So as we can see, there's lots of non-traditional digital spaces where music is being consumed, where Black music is really leading in the consumption in those formats.
And we want to take a moment here to kind of take one insight. A large part of that consumption has to do with the fact that the hip hop and R&B genres tend to trend younger. And because they're more native to the technology, they are consuming more, but purchasing less. And the older generational listeners of rock are buying at pretty much the same rate they have over the years, but they're not converting to the digital streaming. And we also want to take note here to say, this type of data will be you'll see dramatic shifts when you look at it in the context of post-COVID and pre-COVID numbers. We have seen research, more recent research, that suggests that online streaming has increased across the board in all genres. So it may adjust some of the transition of that older generation that tends to listen to rock and country being forced to transition to streaming during the COVID times.
So to Eric's point, we started this research project prior to COVID-19, which has introduced some very different trends and consumption behavior in all areas of consumption, music and entertainment notwithstanding. So you'll notice from this point forward, when we're referencing our research and the data that's been collected for this project, that data covers a time period that ends in December of 2019. Now that was our original data design, but it was quite fortuitous because the very beginning of 2020 is where we see this natural experiment of this very different introduction of a environmental change to consumption. So we recognize that that is not included in this particular research project, but presents an opportunity for us to look at some different things later on. But keeping that in mind, our original literature review, we started looking at where we saw existing literature and previous research done to support some of the trends that we were seeing and that we've talked about thus far. So one of those, in general marketing and consumption research, there is prior research that speaks to a shift in consumption from physical products to more experiential services, which supports the trend that we're seeing from a shift from physical album sales to the more experiential digital consumption and on-demand consumption, but also a shift from the reliance on album sales to consumers going out and purchasing, shifting their actual purchasing from buying the music itself to buying tickets to experience the music with the artists in live shows. If we continue looking at that, we start to see where there's existing research in entertainment and music marketing that speaks to both the trend under concerts and the trend in music genres. So we see under concerts that there's research that has begun showing as early as 2005 that there's a decline in artist revenue from unit sales, and that actually is being offset by a corresponding trend of increasing concert ticket prices, because that's where artists are beginning to pull more of their compensation from. From a genre perspective, we have research that goes out and defines when we mention urban music, and you may have referred us, make some interchangeable references thus far between urban music and Black music. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's prior research that defines urban music as those musical styles that are commonly associated with Black Americans that include the genres of R&B, soul, hip hop, rap, and reggae. So for the first time, as we saw on the previous slide, we started to see in 2017, even in the popular press, like Nielsen and Billboard, where we were starting to report out that Black music genres were starting to outpace pop and rock and other traditional genres as the most popular consumed genre of music in America, which suggests that they're crossing over to a broader, more mainstream audience, which is not likely to be comprised completely or primarily by Black Americans, the way that the genre of the music is described. That allows us to introduce the use of some prior research around the theory of social identity theory. So in consumption research, social identity theory is applied, particularly with those things that are consumed around a group or cultural identity or commonly shared identity. There's a concept of a group prototype or a fuzzy set of shared attributes that the group holds in high regard, and that consumption behavior seeks to reinforce or is strongly driven by that identity, which we think presents some very interesting things as we start to think about crossover and mainstreaming of traditionally Black music forms into a much more broad audience in America, that we can see some things that may be working counter to what some of the commonly held principles of social identity theory are, as one of the easily recognizable things, such as race and the culture that commonly gets associated with race, as we start to see a wider audience beyond Black Americans consuming Black music art forms. There's some interesting things that could be at play from a perspective of applying social identity theory.
So there's several available music industry sources to get data regarding consumption of music and also purchasing tickets at venues. And a lot of these are traditional institutions within the music industry, like Nielsen, Polestar, Billboard, the RIAA. And we'll look at a lot of those tools, but there also are newer measures that we can look at, like Spotify and YouTube, that doesn't necessarily measure purchases, but more about consumption and the time and the quantity in which the consumers are connecting with the music. So we're going to use all these tools, or a lot of them, to really tease out some different trends and some different realities with the data connected once we synergize them all.
So one of the first places that we started with our data collection was Polestar, as Eric mentioned on the previous slide. Polestar is an industry standard source of data for concert data. So it allows us to collect information at a venue level, thinking about things in terms of consumption if we measure it by the volume of tickets sold, average price per ticket, the gross dollar value made from a particular tour or show or at a venue. So it's a very rich and beneficial data for our purposes. So that's the first place that we started. We wanted to get a feel for, would there be enough data available here that we would be able to review for our purposes that allowed us to look at consumption of Black music concerts specifically. So one of the first places that we started from Polestar data was to look at a very nice, succinct package of data that they offer called their North America Top 200 tours. So at the end of every year, Polestar pulls together the top 200 grossing tours in North America. And so we started there. Again, we used an 11-year period from 2009 to 2019. Our reason for doing so is that while we started to see the trends shifting, particularly starting in 2017 around the crossover or greater consumption of Black music outside of a Black American demographic, we wanted to look at the trends leading up to that. So we wanted to see, was there a story there that we could follow leading into 2017 and then the several years after 2017. So we went back to 2009 in order to do that. So we reviewed this top 200 tour for the 11 years, each of those years, and we got a data set of 2,200 tours. And of those 2,200 tours, what we found was that 8% of the tours featured a Black music headlining or co-headlining act. At that point, we realized there is likely to be a good amount of data within the Polestar database that would allow us to tease out Black music shows specifically to be able to do a deeper dive and understand, can we see some behaviors as it pertains to specifically the racial issues, or not issues, but the racial differences around the consumption. And so how we decided to do that was to say, so now that we know that there's North American tours, can we nail that or narrow that down to 2 locations that allow us to compare and contrast the consumption of Black music by a population that is largely Black or African American versus a metropolitan area that is consuming live music, particularly Black music, by a population that's not predominantly Black or African American, and can we compare them and see some differences? So the 2 cities that we decided to choose for this particular research project were Nashville and Memphis. Both cities are in close proximity to each other. They also have rich histories of music and live music performance. And they also presented a very interesting juxtapositioning of their racial demographics in the city. So Nashville, using the American Community Survey data, the most recent American Community Survey data, Nashville had roughly 63% white and 25% or so Black or African American demographic makeup in the city. And Memphis was almost exactly the opposite, with a 66% Black or African American population and a 25% to 28% white population in their city.
And both cities, as Dr. Bryant explained, have very rich musical histories and backgrounds. And because of that, there are several different sized live music venues in each city. So what we did, we broke down the different venues by size. So we have a large venue set, 9,000 plus seats. We have 2 for Nashville, Bridgestone Arena Municipal Auditorium, and then we have the FedEx Forum for Memphis. And FedEx and Bridgestone, the 2 different arenas and forums, pretty much have professional teams that play. They have large concerts, so they're very comparable. Similarly, with the outdoor venues, we have two amphitheaters for each city, or one amphitheater for each city. And then we have medium size traditional theaters, seated theaters, the Schermerhorn Symphony Hall for Nashville and the historic Ryman Auditorium, and the historic Orpheum in Memphis and the Cannon Center for the Performing Arts as well. And then we went down to smaller venues because a lot of the trending musical consumptions with urban music happened in smaller venues as well. So we wanted to measure that. So we have seated, standing, club sized rooms, what the industry typically describes as club sized rooms. And we have very well-known venues in both cities, Minglewood Hall for Memphis and Germantown Performing Arts Center, and then Marathon Music Works and City Winery for Nashville. And so we collected data on how people were actually buying tickets at these venues.
Yes. So, as Eric mentioned, we collected data through the box office tour history. So, Polestar allows you to pull data out of their database and their system for tour histories. You can either pull tour information at the artist level to see over time where they've made their stops, or like what we did, since we had specific venues that we wanted to use, you can pull the tour box office in data by venue specifically, and then look at all the concerts and shows that have come through a venue over a period of time, which is what we did. So after pulling that data, we reviewed the data for each of them. And we went through and we did sort of a very basic content analysis and coding, looking at the total number of shows that occurred at each venue, and then categorizing them based on the primary headlining or co-headlining artist by Black music genre or non-Black music genre, in the same way that we had evaluated the top 200 American tour lists. By filtering that out, it allowed us to see a variety of different trends in the data that Eric will take you through.
Yeah, and some of the interesting trends that we saw, one of the initial ones was that the data reporting it varied wildly across the venues, regardless of the size of the venue. So when you think about Polestar and how it's reported, one thing you have to keep in mind is that it's self-reporting, and the venue's main incentive to do it, one, so they can showcase their successes with the numbers. And so that looks good to people who want to rent it or want to come and perform there. So agents actually look at this data. Concert promoters actually look at this data. And then also the industry gives awards based on these numbers. And those awards can be very beneficial to a venue to use as a promotional tool to promote their venue and what they have to offer the community. Nashville venues, this is another trend that we saw that was interesting. Nashville venues were more likely to report live show data than the Memphis venues, and it's going to be interesting to tease out why that is. But that was something that was pretty clear. And if you look at the categories, Dr. Bryant's going to walk you through some of the more detailed numbers when we look at the different categories from Memphis to Nashville.
Thank you. So this table is actually showing a breakdown. So we have them organized by the venues that Eric took you through our explanation on the previous slide. When you look at each category, from large to outdoor to medium, and then the smaller seated standing room club venues, the way that the venues are organized is that Nashville venues appear at the top, and then the Memphis venues appear below them, so that we can compare within and across categories. We've pulled the information to show how many shows did a particular venue have between 2009 and 2019, how many of them could be classified as Black music shows. And then we look at, well, what percentage does that break down to, so that we could particularly compare within categories, but across categories as well on a standardized basis. Given that The data is self-reported. We did take a look for each venue that we included for a data availability percentage so that we are looking at the numbers and putting them in the right mind. So some venues you will see have much higher data reporting than others. And so we have to take that into consideration when we're looking at the consumption levels that are in the data themselves. We look at the total capacity for each venue, as well as the average number of tickets sold by the Black shows that we have pulled for each venue. And based on that, we compare those to look at what's the average capacity for Black shows at each of the venues that we have. And then we also take that into consideration to look at what's the average gross dollar from the box office for each of these venues in each city, in each category, for those shows that were categorized as Black music shows. So one of the things that jumps out immediately when you look at that is, as Eric mentioned, the Nashville venues were just much more likely to report data into the Polestar system. So we have to take that with a grain of salt when we're comparing it to Memphis. But if we look at on a reported to reported basis, there are some interesting trends that arise. So within the venue categories, what we find is that the smaller Memphis venues are more likely to feature Black music concerts than their Nashville counterparts. And so an example of that is if you go and look in the medium theater venues, if you start to look, we can see where for the Cannon Center for Performing Arts, they've got almost 31% of the 117 shows over that 11-year period were Black music shows, compared to the Ryman, which had almost 1,400 shows in that same time period, but only just under 4% of them were actually Black music shows. That trend continues. If you look at the outdoor venues, Mud Island Amphitheater in Memphis was more than twice as likely to have a Black music show at the amphitheater in the 11-year period than the Ascend Amphitheater was. And that trends also down in the seated standing room club concert category, with the Germantown Performing Arts Center reporting almost 3 times as or more than double the percentage of Black music shows over the 11-year period than its counterparts. A couple of things to note here in this data for both the Cannon Center of Performing Arts and the Germantown Performing Arts. While we can look at the percentage of Black music shows for them, it is much harder to compare some of the other metrics in the table, because in both of those venues, only one of the Black music shows actually reported the detail for average tickets sold and the average, and for tickets sold and the gross. So those averages are not really averages for those two. They're just based on one show each, because the other shows did not have reported data. Another thing to note is that for City Winery in Nashville, it wasn't opened until 2014, so it doesn't have the full 11 years of history. It's only got from 2014 through 2019. You'll also notice that they have a much larger number of shows in that small category, and that's part of their business model because they run shows 7 days a week, where many of the other smaller venues typically are a weekend or Thursday to Sunday option. And so one of the last trends that I want to look at on this particular slide is thinking about the average capacity. So if we go back and look at what the average capacity, how many of these venues sold more tickets that were closer to their total capacity, the Nashville shows tended to sell more of their total capacity of tickets than their Memphis counterparts. One thing to note is in the large venue section, at the FedEx Forum, the Nashville Municipal Auditorium, the Bridgestone Arena, as Eric mentioned earlier, these are very large venues that tend to have more than just your standard concert venue. So they're hosting sporting events, conferences, other types of family programming. And when they are hosting concerts, they're likely on occasion to not use the full capacity because of the way that the venue can be structured to accommodate setup for concerts. So that has to be taken into consideration, and it's definitely something that we'll drill down into as we do more research in this area. But we thought that these very preliminary sort of first look descriptive views of the initial data set still had some very interesting trends that we're looking to see how they play out as we continue the research project. So as we think about how that research project is going to continue, as we build on the descriptive data that we've just walked through, a couple things to note here. One, much of the Polestar data is really going to serve primarily as a dependent variable and in some of our control variables for the data. So looking at consumption as being represented by the number of tickets sold at a given venue, and then thinking about the control variables, so identifying subcategories within Black music like R&B, soul, or hip hop, thinking about the year, recognizing that different things happen in different years that may or may not impact consumption between our two cities. The venue type that we've identified, that capacity, and of course the location that's been identified. And then we plan to build on and include some of those other data sources that Eric talked about earlier. So that's where we'll start to bring in some of the popularity variables. We want to really look at, is consumption a function of the popularity from the traditional sources, like Billboard, like unit sales, like radio play, but also a function of the newer types of popularity and consumption, like the streaming activity and even possibly search activity for artists around the timing of their shows in a particular city. We want to look at that consumption information to see the function, and then also compare that to a model that brings back in the racial demographic consideration of the two cities, so that we can start to tease out, do we see a difference in the factors of popularity having an impact on the consumption of the concerts when we start to layer in the demographic information based on the difference of our two cities with that racial makeup between white and Black.
That concludes our talk. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email Dr. Bryant or myself. Our email addresses are here. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.